So quite often you'll find that there'll be a story about a holy figure who goes off, into a room of their house, for example, in order to live a holy life. And you only find out incidentally that they had a little slave girl who was bringing them food and looking after them. Or, a hermit who goes off into the forest. And then you find out kind of somewhere in the story in the background that there was somebody who was running errands for them and doing that kind of slave work. So there's a way in which those people have always been there, but we haven't noticed them because we've been looking at those famous figures, the holy figures, etc. We haven't noticed all of the kind of army of people who were there. They're the kind of the furniture in the story.
Shadows.
That's right, yes. And so you can see them there if you look for them, if you pay attention. And then if you start to think about their circumstances and what was possible for them, then you can start to fill in the world around them.
Welcome to the Research and Reason podcast. Join us as we discuss the latest research, news and opinion from academics in the Faculty of Arts and Education at the University of Auckland.
Kia ora koutou, ko Julianne Evans aho. I'm the Media Advisor for the Faculty of Arts and Education, and today I'm talking to Lisa Bailey, an Associate Professor of History and Classics and Ancient History in the faculty. Tēnā koe, Lisa. Lovely to have you here.
Tēnā koe, Julianne. Lovely to be here.
You've been thinking about a period in history many of us know very little about, the medieval period of about 400 to 800 AD in Western Europe, with a special focus on the incredible power of the Catholic Church after the collapse of the Roman Empire and how that translated into ideas of service, but also of slavery. And in fact, many of those ideas about those issues, service and slavery, have persisted to the current day. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. So This is a project I've been working on for a while, and I've been exploring the way in which these ideas about service have really been a compelling force within the early Middle Ages, and they are still very much a compelling force with us in the modern world as well. So looking at those kind of connections, the ideas of religious concepts of service to God, to the church, and how that crossed over into ideas about slavery in this period and into modern times as well.
Yeah, how did that work? So there was no Roman Empire, but people still needed to organise their lives. Mm-hmm. They needed to be looked after. Mm-hmm. They needed perhaps to have patrons or people who, could stop them from starving to death. How did the church work in that situation?
Well, it's very much the force that steps into the breach. After the Roman Empire disappears, there are, secular forces who are coming into power, the barbarian kingdoms, the origins of the medieval kingdoms that we know from later on. But it takes a long time for them to develop any kind of systems, any bureaucracy, any social structures. And it's very much the church in this period which already has a whole lot of systems, a whole lot of people in play, a whole lot of structures, a whole lot of money. And they step into that gap and they really, in many ways, become a kind of social safety net for all kinds of people who might otherwise be really struggling.
Yeah, and those areas that you're talking about, I think we mentioned Western Europe. What do they encompass? What were they known as then?
So Francia, which was the kind of kingdom that had replaced the Roman province of Gaul. Then you've got the sort of regions of Italy. You've got the regions of what would become Germany, used to be called Germania. You've got regions in Spain, even right across to the various kingdoms that are in the sort of modern British Isles as well.
And did those people beforehand, they had to sort of swear allegiance to the Roman Empire? Is that what happened? And then they were just sort of told, no, don't worry about it anymore? Or what actually happened in that transition?
Well, it was very messy, to be honest.
Yes.
So it wasn't any kind of clear transition. It happened gradually. It happened over a number of years, even centuries in some ways, where the Roman Empire was sort of gradually withdrawing, becoming weaker, less powerful, and other people were stepping gradually into that breach. And so you've got some, what we call barbarian forces who are coming into positions of power and taking over regions, but they're not necessarily interested in kind of day-to-day bureaucracy and running things, which is something the Roman Empire was known for, of course, kind of keeping things functioning. And so the church was in many ways stepping into that kind of a gap.
How did people engage with the church? What were the ways that the church looked after them, and what price did it extract from people?
Well, all kinds of things. So, I mean, in the book I'm looking at a whole range of people across the social spectrum, right? So some of the people I'm looking at are right at the top of the level: queens, kings, really powerful members of the nobility who find places to express their power through religion and through roles within the church as bishops, as abbots, as abbesses, or just expressing their piety. But I'm interested in everybody right down to the lowest members of the society. So I'm interested in slaves. I'm interested in people who are in situations of unfree labour, who are working on church lands, who are sweeping out the churches, who are lighting the lamps, who are keeping those higher members of society
washing the
fed.
robes.
Yes, washing the
doing
robes,
the flowers,
doing the laundry, doing the cooking, all of the cleaning, all of the stuff that has to be done on a day-to-day basis, but might be doing it within the context of a church structure, right? So you have to, it takes an army of people to keep those churches running. And so there's all of these people who are in positions of service to the church. Some of them are free, some of them are enslaved, but many of them have very little power within that society.
So coming to the idea of slavery, and at this point I feel like we should mention that you have a book about this very subject, and I'll give you a plug for that right now. It's called Servants of God, Slaves of the Church, Service as Religious Metaphor and Religious Reality in Early Medieval Europe, published by Cornell University Press, just out now,
Indeed.
hot off the press.
Indeed.
And that's why Lisa knows so much about this subject, because she spent the last number of years, I'm sure, looking into it. But I want to go back to the idea of slavery, because that seems... I don't know why, but it seems like quite an extreme thing still to imagine was going on. How did people become slaves of the church?
In a number of different ways. So the church, in the early Middle Ages, was the largest slave owner in Western Europe, by far, as an institution.
And this is the Catholic Church
that's the only church that's around. Obviously, this is before the Protestant Reformation, so this is at a stage when there's really only one church structure in this region. So, that's something that people don't really think about, the fact that the church in this period owned large numbers of people as property. And they became... Already, absolutely, and had done for quite some time, really from a very early stage. So people could become slaves of the church in a number of ways. If you were born to somebody who was already a slave of the church, then you would become enslaved yourself. It was hereditary. But also people would sometimes enter church service voluntarily or in a coerced way. So sometimes people were donated by their secular owners if they were enslaved to somebody who then donated their property to the church. Often the people who worked that land would go along with the property and they would be owned by the church at that point. Also, people might sometimes go voluntarily into service to the church if they, for example, had a debt that they couldn't pay back. The church might pay that debt, and in return they would become slaves of the church and their children after them. Or sometimes people would join it because they needed protection, maybe from somebody more powerful within their society, and the church was an option for them to provide that protection in return for their service. So there's different kinds of levels of coercion and voluntary engagement with this, and people, for sometimes it would have been an improvement in their situation to be serving the church, and other times they and their children and the generations after were being locked into something that was coercive for them.
Yeah, because sometimes I imagine the alternative to this sort of slavery was dying of starvation,
absolutely,
for example, as simple as that, and having nowhere to live and no one to help you at all.
Absolutely,
yeah. In terms of the idea of the slavery, did that mean in some cases that they were literally not free to move anywhere beyond the church grounds, or did it mean that they could travel as normal, or that they could sometimes have freedom to do what they wanted, or was it entirely controlled, do you think?
It meant that they didn't have the choice about those matters. So they might be able to travel, for example, if they were permitted to do so, but it wasn't up to them to make a choice like that. So they sometimes you see people who are enslaved within early medieval society who have quite a lot of power within that society. They can actually kind of have quite a lot of action. They're given quite a lot of autonomy. They're able to engage and with other people outside and travel and do all kinds of things. But that wasn't within their power to determine. So ultimately that kind of freedom comes down to that question of can they decide it for themselves?
Who owns who. And were they paid?
No, if you were enslaved, then you weren't paid.
No,
but
paid in accommodation, I
Yes,
guess.
that's right. You were looked after. And sometimes people would be given little kind of rewards, which they could sort of dispense with for themselves, but they weren't, earning wages as we would understand it. Yeah.
And in particular, you look at women in that environment, and you were mentioning in the book, I think, that these are people in the margins of history generally, very often, especially at the low levels. How did you discover some of these people hidden in the mists of history? Because I think that's so interesting how you would do that. I mean, imagine you travelled for a start.
Yep, so I did, yes. But also quite often those people are there in the text that we've been reading for a long time, but nobody's paid them any attention. So you don't have to go into an archive to find some of those women. Sometimes you just have to read the text that we've already had, but pay attention to who's there in the background. So quite often you'll find that there'll be a story about a holy figure who goes off, into a room of their house, for example, in order to live a holy life. And you only find out incidentally that they had a little slave girl who was bringing them food and looking after them. Or, a hermit who goes off into the forest. And then you find out kind of somewhere in the story in the background that there was somebody who was running errands for them and doing that kind of slave work. So there's a way in which those people have always been there, but we haven't noticed them because we've been looking at those famous figures, the holy figures, etc. We haven't noticed all of the kind of army of people who were there. They're the kind of the furniture in the story.
Shadows.
That's right, yes. And so you can see them there if you look for them, if you pay attention. And then if you start to think about their circumstances and what was possible for them, then you can start to fill in the world around them. And that's true for both male and female slaves.
How did you go about that? How did you find your sources beyond things that you'd already been reading in your texts?
I just tried to read everything I could, basically, from this time period. I've been working in this period for a while, so I knew some of the texts already. But there's a way in which they come up in many different contexts, right? So it's not going to be all in one source. There are obviously the sort of legal texts which talk about the situation of people like that. But there's also hagiographies, which are stories about the lives of saints, in which often they give you lots of details about their context, about their background, about their environment, and all the people who are around them. And so you can explore those. There are letters that people are writing at high levels of society in which they mention lands that they're donating, people that might be donated with them, the problem that they're having with one of their, people in their service who's run away or is causing them issues. So you can kind of look for the people in the kind of margins of those texts as well.
Who wrote those lives of saints, the hagiographies that you mentioned? Who are they passed down? They're passed down for a very long period of time. But did one individual write them, or are they a collective thing?
Usually they're written by an individual initially. They're often anonymous, so we don't necessarily have the name of the person who would write them. They were often religious figures, monks, clerics. There were women as well who wrote them, often nuns who are in communities and might write them about other women within their community who'd passed on. But these were also told orally. So, yes, they were written texts, but these are texts which were read aloud, particularly in churches and at the festivals of these saints. So even people who could not read would have heard these stories about these people, would have heard the stories and taken the messages on board as well.
And would that language be Latin?
Yes, that's
as
right,
the
yes.
sort of general language of
yes.
the church.
Yeah, that's still very much the language that everyone is speaking. So yeah,
across all of those places that later became France, Spain, Germany.
Yes.
Yeah. And that language was the day-to-day language of the people on the street?
Yep, absolutely. So there are some other languages that are being spoken in this period at this time that have come with different barbarian groups. But in most of those regions, Latin was still the dominant language. That's why French is based on Latin, right? It's a Romance language because it's evolved out of Latin, not from the language that the Franks spoke. That's not the language that became the common language in those regions.
And that's from the Romans, presumably.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So it wasn't all poor people on the margins of society that were involved with the church in a very high-profile way, because you mentioned one particular person, a woman who sounds very fascinating and whose name I think I'll get you to pronounce.
Balthilde, I think you're talking about.
Balthilde, who is sort of immortalised in things like statues. In fact, in the Jardin de Luxembourg in Paris, for example, and other places. Tell me about her and and how her story unfolded.
Certainly, she's an amazing woman who had a really, really fascinating story that should be known much more widely, I think. So we learn about her in a few different texts, but our main source is a life, which was written her, so a hagiographic text, which was written about her after she died by probably a member of her religious community. But that text tells us that she was a Saxon slave. So she came probably from somewhere in Britain and was brought across the water, probably by a slave trader, and brought into Francia, into kind of modern France. And she was sold for a cheap price. That's what the hagiographer tells us. It was a cheap price. So she was not a prestigious slave. She was a kind of lowly person at that point. But she was sold into the household of a very important man, a man who was kind of like the main assistant to the king, the main kind of head
to the king
his
of
household.
France.
One of the kings in that region of Francia. Yes, there's a few different kings, yeah. And so she's serving in his household, and the hagiography tells us of her various attributes. It tells us that she was beautiful and that she was intelligent and that she kind of rose in his service to this position of prestige. And it implies that he, fell in love with her, her owner, and wished to marry her. It's making probably something respectable that was probably a lived reality of many female slaves, which is that they were sexually exploited in these households. But in the story, it becomes a kind of a romance, right?
Because the king was already married, presumably.
The king is not married at this point. So she's still in the household of he's called the mayor of the palace.
Oh, yeah.
So the hagiographic text tells us that she did not want to marry her owner, and that she ran away and she hid herself under rags, and she wanted to dedicate herself to God, and so that the mayor of the palace couldn't find her and ended up marrying someone else, which is a very strange story to have told about this. It's clearly trying to make what really happened into a kind of a fabula, into a kind of a compelling tale for the readers later on. But then we're told that she marries the king, and we're not told how that happened. We're not told what are the circumstances.
Which is a much higher up person.
Absolutely.
She's gone right up to the very top.
So we have to imagine all of the things that went on that behind this.
In between hiding from the mayor
and
marrying the king.
So she marries the king, and we're told that she, as queen, is as the kind of ideal queen, right? So she's gone from being a slave, now she's the queen of this whole region, and ends up her husband ends up taking over all of Francia. She has 3 sons with him. She's working with the bishops. She's supporting the church. She's founding religious communities. Really interestingly, one of the things she wants to do is stop the slave trade. So she tries to stop the slave trade, which obviously she herself had been a victim of. So it's a really interesting figure. She's kind of celebrated later on as a sort of early abolitionist because of this.
Because she is a real figure, isn't she? She's not a mythical person.
No, she's absolutely a real person. Whether she did all these things, we don't know. But she certainly did a lot of them. And then her husband dies while her son is still young, and she actually becomes regent. So she is the ruler of Francia in practice for quite a long time in the name of her son. And eventually, again, we're not really told the details of this. She's kind of forced out by some of the factional politics, and she ends up retiring to one of the religious communities that she founded and lives the rest of her life and goes back to behaving like a slave again. So we're told that while she was in this religious community, even though she'd been a queen and the ruler of France for all of these years, she goes back to cleaning the latrines and sweeping the floor of the church and demonstrating her humility, her piety and humility. So it's a kind of this full circle.
Wow, yes.
Story.
Rags to riches to rags.
Again, yes.
Wow. Quite an extraordinary person.
She is, yes.
How long did she live for?
We don't know exactly, but she probably died in about her mid-40s.
Gosh, and she crammed a lot.
She did.
Into her
she did
life.
A lot in that time, yes. Mm-hmm.
I mean, what are the chances of that happening normally? They must be incredibly slim.
That's obviously
surely.
A very rare thing to have happened.
I mean, that sounds like your standard fairy tale, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
And a sort of Cinderella story almost.
It's obviously been made by the person who's writing the story of her life into even more of a fairy tale sort of story than it must really have been. But we can read through that into some of the kind of social reality behind it. So to the situation of kind of sexual threat and vulnerability for women in households like that, we can clearly see that lying behind the story. We can also see the kind of way in which she clearly felt strongly about her own experiences, that she was trying to put an end to the slave trade. This was obviously something that was a very real concern for her as an individual, as a real historical person.
Has she been widely studied?
She has not, no.
No.
She should be.
Yeah. So would I be fair to say that you are one of the few to give her a lot more weight than she has had up to now in your book?
Indeed, yes. She's just recently had a modern biography written of her, which is something that she hadn't had before. But she hasn't really kind of broken through into the sort of the mainstream consciousness, shall we say.
Yeah, because she's there are sort of other figures like Hildegard, what's her name, of Bingham,
Of Bingham, yes.
and people like that who seem to have come through for other reasons to do with, for example, her musical talents.
Indeed. Yeah.
But not this person that and then I went looking for her, and I found that statue.
Yeah.
And there are some other references to her, visual references, aren't there?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
But one thing I wonder, if she was a slave and she was treated as one, in her early life, how in the world did she ever get any education or any ability to read or write or think about the world beyond herself, I wonder?
That's a great question, and we don't know the answers to those things, and we don't know whether she could read or write, right? So it's entirely possible that she couldn't. You could be the ruler of Francia without doing those things because you had other people who could do those things for you.
Right.
We're not sure of the literacy level of some of the kings either, for that
No.
matter. Though they would have, had presumably some education growing up, but whether they could, they were fully literate as we would understand it is not clear. So we don't know the answers to those questions, and we have someone else within her community who's writing the story of her life, so they are obviously a literate person. Education was available for women in those kinds of a contexts. Whether she had it, we just don't know.
Which is so interesting, isn't it? That women were able to be educated. Yeah, and I suppose that's a lot. In fact, that's thanks to the church in some
absolutely.
respects
That's
as
the
well.
context in which that is happening.
The scholarship and the literacy. So it wasn't all bad.
No. And in fact, female monastic communities were the ones who were copying a lot of the manuscripts in this period. So a lot of the texts that we have that survive from antiquity right through to the modern period are thanks to those women who were writing them.
And you probably had a bit of time, to do so.
They did. Well,
Because
they had these very
weren't,
structured lives, but they had time set aside for exactly those kinds of tasks.
because they weren't married with children
That's
and
right,
having to
yeah.
look after their husbands and their households and their children.
Yeah,
So they
indeed.
perhaps they had that time.
Yeah.
And in some ways, what a bonus for them.
Yes, I mean, so for many of them, it would have been, an opportunity they would not have otherwise had, yes. But we also know that some of them were in those communities not by choice. So Balthilde, for example, was probably forced into that by some kind of political machinations that we don't hear about.
You mean eventually?
Eventually, towards the end of her life. So would she have chosen to spend the last years of her life in that religious community otherwise? We don't really know, so...
No, because those communities were also really self-sufficient with how they grew their food and how they made art and also illuminated manuscripts and things.
Not so much
Not
much in these ones at this period, but that does that in some other areas in this time.
They
yes.
did. And then we talked about at the beginning the idea that service and slavery were, which we, particularly slavery, of course, we now think of in the most negative possible terms. But in what ways did those early ideas affect later life for people, for example, in the American South, for example, to perhaps justify slavery and those kinds of things?
Well, it was really profoundly important, actually, in the kind of justifications for how people carried out slavery in subsequent centuries. So a lot of the kind of important thinkers of the period that I'm looking at, the early Middle Ages, figures like Saint Augustine of Hippo, Saint Gregory the Great, these are people who wrote about slavery in their period and justified it as part of God's plan for the world and said this is in the interests of the slaves, this is something that is right and proper, and it's part of kind of the kind of journey of these people to get into heaven. So it's all to the good, right? And so they're writing about this stuff, and those are people who are celebrated as saints of the church and whose writings were copied out in places like the monasteries that we've been talking about and were read right up until, the 19th century. People are reading taking those same texts and justifying slavery. So we know that, justifications of how slavery is practiced in 19th century Southern America, for example, they're drawing on figures like Augustine of Hippo and saying, this is all part of God's plan. This is all to the good of the slaves, and it's in their interests to be looked after by us in the same kind of way. So it's a really powerful and important set of ideas. Yeah,
like a natural hierarchy,
absolutely,
in which God is at the top, and then noble kings and queens and princes and noblemen, and then onwards down, which sort of justifies a class system, I guess, as well, does it?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. But also there's a way in which the kind of suffering of the slaves is justified as being part of the rightful order of society, that suffering is part of how you get to heaven. So in a way, there's no kind of motivation to improve the lives of the lots of those people. Yeah.
And how do they justify the fact that some people, down at that bottom level, were supposed to suffer, whereas people further up the food chain didn't as much?
Well, the idea was that everybody was suffering in different kinds of ways.
Right. So some people just had more money while they were doing it.
Well, they were suffering from different kinds of things. So yes, it's part of actually this kind of idea of the metaphorical form of slavery. And this is something that goes back to the ancient Greeks. Like you find the same idea in Greek materials, that slavery to lust or slavery to greed was even perhaps a worse kind of slavery than literal slavery. This idea that metaphorical slavery could be a greater form of suffering. And so you in fact find this idea that and right through to the modern period, that in fact slavery operating on a metaphorical level was something that should be taken more seriously than slavery on a literal level.
Slavery to addictions and to improper thoughts and all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But then, of course, abolitionists came in and completely said, that's all rubbish, we don't agree with that. You're basically just using these things to justify a horrendous practice. Is that what happened?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And Balthilde, for example, becomes a kind of celebrated figure in the French abolitionist movement because of this kind of opposition that she had to the slave trade. So people are still looking back to the early Middle Ages on both sides to find their justifications.
Yeah, because we tend to refer to that period, and I know historians don't anymore, as the Dark Ages. That must be sort of a point of great contention, is it, among people?
It is. I'm not horribly invested in that as a term either.
No. But I think probably because it's far too, it doesn't take into account all of the things that are going on and all of the thinking and all of the other things happening, does it? Yeah.
It's dark in the sense that we don't know as much about it. So you can say that we have less light that is cast upon that period because we have many fewer sources than from earlier periods and later periods. But there's plenty of stuff going on. So
Absolutely. All right. Well, look, thank you so much, Lisa. I'll give your book another plug. Just in case people hadn't remembered, it's called Servants of God, Slaves of the Church, Service as Religious Metaphor and Religious Reality in Early Medieval Europe, published by Cornell University Press. It's out now. Where can people find it?
I think mostly buy it online at Cornell University Press.
Okay. And who is going to enjoy reading it?
Well, everybody, I hope.
Everyone, but in particular who?
Well, I think anybody who's interested in the history of Christianity and the history of the church and the history of the early Middle Ages and the history of slavery and the history of kind of the continuities of human behaviour almost. There's a lot there that will resonate, I think, for people.
Great. Thank you, Ngā mihi nui. Thank you very much, Lisa.
Ngā mihi, Julianne.
You've been listening to the Research and Reason podcast. Stay up to date with the Faculty of Arts and Education by following us on social media.